Hello, and welcome to the Philosopher's Compass podcast. I'm your host, Meredith Alexander Kunz. I'm a writer, speaker, and Stoic practitioner, as well as a mom and a professional. I launched the Stoic Mom blog 9 years ago to explore how parents and kids can benefit from Stoic philosophy. And this podcast focuses on how folks are using philosophy in their everyday lives, living it, teaching it, sharing it, and finding meaning and purpose and maybe even joy in it. So today I'm going to have a great guest, his name is Gregory B. Sadler, a speaker, author, educator, consultant, and philosophical counselor who brings philosophy into practice. Greg is a faculty member at the Milwaukee Institute of Art and Design, as well as president of the philosophical consulting firm ReasonIO. He hosts a highly successful YouTube channel on philosophy and is co-host of the Wisdom for Life radio show. Greg is a member of the Modern Stoicism Steering Committee, and he was editor of the online publication Stoicism Today from 2016 to 2023. And in fact, that's one of the ways I first met Greg when I was first getting involved in the online Stoic community around 7-8 years ago. And I saw he was editing this publication. I saw some of his, involvement, and I reached out. And I have always loved hearing his insights about philosophy and life. And so I'm really glad that Greg is joining me today. Thank you for being here.
Oh, thanks for the invitation. And I kind of think it's an interesting thing. We were kicking around, well, how did we actually meet in the first place? And I think that's kind of a good sign when you don't know right away, because we've had so many interactions in so many different ways. But as you pointed out, we've never been physically in the same place at the same time, which, is kind of a cool thing about the late modern era that we live in,
That's right. It's one of the good things about the internet and social media. One of the silver linings is we can actually meet and online. And, I look forward to the day where I'll be able to meet you in person. But until then, I'm following your work online and always enjoying it. And first of all, I just want to say the breadth of what you cover is astounding to me. I'm always seeing new videos, new takes on things I've thought about in the past or things I've never even encountered. And it's just eye-opening to me how you cover so much. And in fact, I'm actually interested in hearing that how do you kind of cover that waterfront of so many different philosophers, thinkers, writers, ideas?
Yeah, well, I think some people would actually consider it a disadvantage because actually I had a comment like that just on a YouTube video, I think yesterday, where somebody was saying that somebody else was clearly a fraud because they mentioned a bunch of writers that they're into, and they were like, you can only really be into one or two. And I thought, well, I mean, there are some people like that, who are obsessed with John Locke or, I don't know, Hegel or somebody along those lines. But for me, I've always been drawn into a whole bunch of interesting paths that we could name with movements of philosophy like Stoicism or Platonism, or with the names of the actual philosophers. And it does present a bit of a disadvantage because you don't get to go quite as deep all the time. But if you do it for a while, you start to see common connections, and you see people referencing each other, like, with Seneca, for example, we get to learn interesting things about the earlier Stoics or about Aristotle and Plato that aren't in their texts because we've lost, a significant part of literature. And so it doesn't become like this, you're drawn off in a million different directions thing. There's convergence that happens. You start seeing common themes, like the notion of virtue or the importance of relationships or those sorts of things. And I mean, it certainly helps that you could say that I got to study philosophy in an academic way at a good time in the 1990s and early 2000s, when you could easily find a job that wouldn't be particularly distracting and would pay enough to afford afford your apartment and not have to think a lot about that sort of stuff, right? So I had that leisure that I think a lot of younger people don't necessarily have today. And then I taught philosophy for a living. I did the traditional academic philosopher, being a professor sort of thing for about 9 years, teaching in prison for Ball State University, and then teaching at a regular state college, well, a university, Fayetteville State University. So, that gives you an advantage because you've got access, for one thing, to a decent library, which I think is quite helpful. I mean, now with the internet, we've got so many texts available online. That wasn't the case in the 90s. And, you're getting paid to do that sort of work, so you can afford to set aside plenty of time. And so I think that gave me a kind of advantage. And then when I, kind of struck out on my own and started just teaching part-time and doing all these other things, I had a good basis. And when I teach, so this semester I'll be shooting some videos on people who I haven't done in the past, because I'm teaching an intro class that I decided to orient to love, friendship, and desire. So it's an opportunity to teach some thinkers and texts that I haven't done before, where I've done the text but I haven't focused on that part of the text, like with Simone de Beauvoir's The Second Sex, which is a gigantic book. Nobody actually, teaches the entirety of it. There's a section on the woman in law that I've read, but I haven't taught before. So I'll have to produce resources for my students, And, after, over time, they just kind of accumulate. I mean, I've got about 3,600 videos in the YouTube channel at this point in time.
Wow.
I've been doing it for 14 years. So, it's sort of like anything else. I guess if you were collecting glass jars or something for 14 years, you'd probably have an entire room full of them by that time, right?
Right,
so,
right.
Yeah. And I don't throw any of them out. So.
Right. Well, that's another beauty of the internet. We can kind of save these things and keep it out there. And
that's right. Yeah.
Yeah. No, I need to watch even more of your videos. And whenever I listen to your lectures, I'm always just, I absolutely love it. And you're such a prolific teacher. So I was kind of wondering about, what is it like? You have kind of the teaching in universities and colleges side, and then you also have the side of teaching philosophy on YouTube and other social channels. And I'm kind of interested in, what's it like for both of those sides? Like, what are students interested in today? And then what about the world out there? And how do you tailor it to these audiences?
Yeah, the what are students interested in? You've got like people who are studying philosophy, but that's a very small sliver of those who are, say, watching videos, because a lot of people can't even afford to go to college or university in the present. It's quite tough for the younger generations to be able to make their way in life the way that I think earlier generations could take for granted. So there's a wide range of people, we'll just call them lifelong learners, because that's a preferred term these days, who are, very interested in learning about things. And, it could be philosophy, it could be history, it could be literature, it could be all sorts of things in the humanities. I don't really worry too much about tailoring anything for an audience in terms of content, except once in a while I'll do like a poll where I'll be like, hey, I'm going to do another Philip K. Dick novel. Which one should I shoot videos on next? Or, I'm going to do some podcast episodes. Who should I, here's 4 choices. Who would you like to see stuff on? A lot of what I'm doing is filling in gaps, because my ambition is to cover a lot of stuff. And it's interesting because people will say, oh my gosh, I look at the channel and you've got all these different people that you're covering. But it's kind of like a spectrograph, where if you look at, something for a compound or an element, there's actually like just a few lines here and there and then big black gaps in between. And you're like, so take early modern philosophy. So I've done videos on a few on Francis Bacon, some on Thomas Hobbes, some on René Descartes, some on Blaise Pascal, David Hume, and then Kant, of course, and Bentham, Wollstonecraft, and I'm leaving somebody out. But I haven't done a single video on, I haven't done any core concept videos on John Locke or Leibniz or Spinoza or any of these people. So those are some pretty big gaps, right? And some of the time I'm looking at it and I'm like, well, I really need to get around to doing videos on this person because it's kind of a shame to leave that wide open like that. And then sometimes I'll be overly ambitious and, setting it, like I was going to do all of Augustine's Confessions, all the key ideas. And I still haven't covered them all. But I did a bunch a while back, and then I had a whole bunch of thumbnails ready for me to use, and I just didn't shoot them. And so they sat on my desktop for, 3 or 4 years. And then finally this summer, I was like, okay, probably should shoot those videos, right? And so a lot of it is like that. It's not super well planned. It's more like seeing what can I actually get done at this point in time. I probably should do some sort of like strategic planning, but I haven't done it yet.
But it sounds like you're being led by your own curiosity and your own kind of desire to really increase your knowledge and other people's knowledge on, as you said, there's kind of some spikes. Maybe I'd love to hear about that actually, because you mentioned virtue and you mentioned love. What are themes that really, interest your curiosity? What are you drawn towards?
That's a great question. There's some consistent themes, I would say, running throughout. And this is where some of the people, complain about, you don't cover this enough, because I'm focused on something else. I do a lot of work in ethics broadly considered because I consider that to be really important for us as human beings. And it's a very interesting field. So anything concerning, what we ought to do or what we ought not to do and how we ought to live together, how we should understand our relationships, what it means to grow as a person or to decline as a person. Those are all things that, lots and lots of philosophers have discussed. I do get into some metaphysical stuff, but I'll admit that I'm not as enamored of that as I am with ethics. I do some work in aesthetics, but I'm not an expert in the field. And it's kind of a shame that I teach at an Institute of Art and Design, and I've never designed an aesthetics class for them, which I should do down the line. And then, I guess a lot of it too is like trying to put people into their perspective. So here's a great example. Somebody who I've come to appreciate a lot, I would say over maybe the last 5-6 years, who I didn't in the past, is Plutarch. And, we generally encounter him in high school when they assign us Plutarch's Lives, and we have to read about those parallel biographies. And that's cool stuff. But that isn't, I won't say that isn't his main work, because that's half of his work. But the other half is something called the Moralia, which are all these really cool essays written from a broadly Platonist perspective that wants to also take the other key schools like the Epicureans and Stoics and Skeptics and Aristotelians seriously and go further with the philosophy. And I've come to really appreciate how profound a thinker he can be. And so, I just keep reading more and shooting more videos on him and introducing my students to him in classes. Like this semester, we're actually going to be doing, so in that love and friendship class, they're going to be reading this dialogue called How to Tell a Friend from a Flatterer, which it turns out to be incredibly up to date. All the same techniques are being used by the flatterer. today as they were in the past. We're just not doing it at like wine drinking parties typically. So yeah.
Sometimes.
Yeah.
No, that's fascinating. I mean, and that's one thing that I always, I've studied history for a long time. I've studied philosophy in recent years, and you just kind of do get a sense for people haven't changed that much. I mean, people have changed, and luckily we have, new concepts of human rights and things like that. But the some of the basic impulses and the basic social ways of interacting sometimes are remarkably similar. And when you read these, especially ancient texts, for me, I am blown away by that, just that realization and the flatterer. And of course, but now we have a new layer to this, which is the AI as the flatterer. I have been thinking about that a lot because people, I work with people who work with AI, and then of course everyone in business is being asked, and students, of course, are doing it too, being asked to use AI and being exposed to AI. And AI is a flatterer. I mean, if you ask a ChatGPT a question about something about yourself, you will get validation and flattery. And so I'd love your thoughts on that in relation to Plutarch. And in fact, you're also reminding me I really need to read some more Plutarch too. But it's just, these things take new forms, but they're kind of old problems.
Yeah, I mean, and you could ask, what does the AI get out of buttering us up? I mean, with a human person, you can be like, okay, so they're looking for people to give them approval or affection, or they're trying to manipulate us. And I mean, an AI is, AI is just a metaphor. There's no intelligence actually there. It's a product of human intelligence. So that's one issue. Why did the programmers set it up in such a way that it basically, kisses our butts? And I actually, I told one AI recently to quit being so, how did I put it? Deferential and positive. Just give me what I'm asking you for without all the rah-rah stuff. And I guess, it's interesting. I never thought that we would see this day, but there are people who are apparently getting caught up in getting so attached to the AI that they're working with, usually a therapist or girlfriend or because it's not usually boyfriend, that there's something that's being called, and I don't know if this is also too metaphorical, AI psychosis, where they start to believe it's real and interact with it and can get really emotionally invested in it,
kind of lose track of reality by getting into this world. And it's really, really interesting. I think that it's meant to humanize these AIs, right? So that we do interact with them as if they're human and we aren't afraid of them, because the whole narrative of AI being scary is still out there. But maybe there's a way in which it's not the ideal parts of human nature. It's kind of this buttering you up, like you said. And I just find that so curious.
Yeah, I suppose probably there was some decision making on the part of humans early on. This would be a good strategy for getting around the fears that have been brewing for, in popular culture about 100 years, I guess.
Yeah, really interesting. But I wanted to talk with you a bit about Stoicism, because this is how we met and how you're very influential in the online Stoic community. And I was curious about how you first got interested in Stoicism.
Two ways. And they both had to do with things that I was particularly interested in. So, I had kind of the typical philosophy education as an undergraduate, where, the Stoics, you'd read Epictetus's Enchiridion, and you knew about Marcus Aurelius, and I had a copy of the Meditations, but there wasn't any real discussion after that. You didn't read any Seneca, for example, which they could have done, but the reason we didn't is because our professors didn't know much about it, and there was this very prevalent conception that like, oh, all that Hellenistic philosophy, that's not real philosophy. There's Plato and Aristotle, and then it just kind of goes into decline until we get to somebody like Plotinus. And then, we jump into medieval philosophy with Augustine.
Right.
And so my professors, who, were actually getting close to retiring and didn't really care much about their teaching. That's what their take was. And I didn't know any better. So when I got to graduate school, I became more and more interested in questions about what we could call the faculty of the will and how it is that we shape ourselves with this thing that can work on itself, but is already in like a damaged condition by the time that it's doing it. And I was in a used bookstore in Carbondale, where I was going to graduate school, and there was a copy of Epictetus's Discourses. And so, in bookstores at that time, you'd kind of kill time by standing around opening up books and reading them. And I started reading that, and I was like, whoa, this guy's actually got a lot of interesting things to say that can go toe to toe with, say, Aristotle or, Kant or some of these other people. And so I bought the book and I took it home and I was reading it. And so I was like, yeah, this is good stuff, And then the other big thing was anger management, because I have struggled with anger since I was a kid. And it was becoming a significant problem, both for me, and I could see it in other people in graduate school. Like our professors would get in shouting matches in the hallways with each other. And I was like, man, I know I'm screwed up, but what's wrong with these people over here that they're,
Right.
they're supposed to be rational, right?
Right.
So I got very interested in what ancient philosophers and also medievals had to say about anger. And at first it was primarily Aristotle who I was looking at, with some Plato. And then somebody was like, well, Seneca's got a whole book on anger. You should check that out. So I read that and I was like, oh, this is really good stuff here. I'm not sure I buy that anger is always bad in every single circumstance, the sort of zero tolerance approach, but there were so many useful insights and perspectives, and Epictetus had those as well, and Marcus had those. So I started applying those things first in my life. And I mean, it wasn't successful at the start, the way it never is, right? You got to keep working at it. But over time, I found that it was quite helpful, and then it became kind of a area of research for myself and practice with clients and giving talks. Actually, the first Stoicon that I talked at, I did a workshop on Stoics on anger, and
oh wow,
yeah. So that's the stuff that hooked me in, and then I guess you could say the other factor was, so Stoicism, we know, was a systematic philosophy developing in the Hellenistic era and then continuing on really until the Christian era. And we've lost a lot of the literature, but we have enough to piece together a good picture of what it is that they thought, mostly about ethics. I mean, some of their physics, meaning cosmology and theology and stuff like that, we have little bits of that, and we have little bits of the logic, but we don't have most of it. So, but we do have a lot of great stuff. And so I'm the kind of person who really enjoys doing what I call philosophical detective work, which is you have a bunch of different texts that people aren't reading together, and you start finding the common connections between them. So, for example, I just finished up teaching a class in my Study with Sadler Academy on Stoicism and the Cardinal Virtues. And there is no text that you can go to on the cardinal virtues and the subordinate virtues. There's a lot of people who talk about them, but I don't think that there's a very widespread understanding of how these things fit together. And it makes perfect sense, because there, you have these summaries of Stoic doctrine that tell you, okay, here's the 5 sub-virtues of courage, but then that list, that's from Arius Didymus. It doesn't match what's in Diogenes or what's talked about in Cicero exactly. Or so you have to read across, about 6 or 7 different thinkers, depending on which virtue you're looking at. And you have to correlate the things that they're saying with each other. And they're also in 2 different languages, in the original. So sometimes you got to be like, what's the Latin equivalent of this Greek term, that I should be looking for in Seneca or in Cicero. So I love those sorts of projects, like figuring out, okay, so Epictetus tells us that we need to work on our preconceptions or prolepses. Well, who else talks about this? It turns out that Seneca does, but he doesn't call them that. And it was an Epicurean concept at one time that got drawn in to Stoicism. So, doing that kind of work, I find that interesting. And I think a lot of people like the end product of it. They don't like the stuff on the way. It's sort of like, going to a restaurant. Unless you're some sort of obsessive foodie, you don't really want to see the chef doing everything in the kitchen. You want the nice thing that comes out plated, ready for you to enjoy. I think a lot of people are like that with the kind of work that I do. They're like, just give me the actual results. And so, I do.
Right.
Yeah.
It's interesting what you're sharing too about how you came to Stoicism, because I kind of have a bit of a parallel story myself, where I was a grad student, and I went to the library at Stanford. I was just going through the stacks, and I came across this book, and it was an Epictetus translation that had also been kind of like, there was calligraphy and stuff added to it, so it combined my interest in art. I'm gonna go try to find this book, but I combined my interest in sort of art and history and philosophy, and I looked at this book and I thought, this is kind of revolutionary. To me, this is just such a great take on how to live. And I thought, most philosophy I tried to study, I did love it, but I also thought a lot of it wasn't really that applicable to kind of my life, right? Yeah. But that was so clearly, the handbook, the Enchiridion is so clearly, about how to live. And then later on, when I, became a parent and I was working with my 2 daughters, I was stressed, and I was like feeling the anxiety of like how to be a good mom and how to, raise good people in this world. And so that's when I kind of turned back to, and I realized there's this modern movement around Stoicism, and I got very excited and into that. So it's interesting, the parallels you're talking about. Yeah.
I think, so there's the anxiety, which is something that we feel in ourselves. And then there's all this social pressure too, right?
Yes, 100%.
Especially around motherhood. I mean, less so than fatherhood in American culture. But there's some about that too.
Yes.
And I think Stoicism is helpful for helping us realize that we don't need to like listen to everybody's messages, and maybe some of them could be harmful for us or counterproductive, and we have to figure out how to like screen them out.
Yes, that's so true. And it's something I constantly think about, because you're right. And that's only increased in this world of, social media and everything is, there's always judgment everywhere you go. So it's always, and this is something I try to teach my kids, and I try to think about even for people I know. It's like, what really matters? It's your character, and it's the way you kind of build your character and work towards virtue. And in my world, that it's really sometimes hard to keep that in mind because of all the pressures and the judgments and the stresses and the way people look at you and perceive you. And you really have to fight and a bit like swim upstream to keep this in mind.
Yeah. And you don't want to dismiss like everybody's perspectives and just retreat to the so-called inner citadel, right? Because there are going to be some people that you do need every once in a while who are going to be like, hey man, you're screwing up, you need to like pay attention to this. But sifting out who those helpful voices, well-meaning voices are compared to like, I don't know, all the grifters trying to make a buck on, making you feel guilty about stuff and then trying to sell you some coaching package or product or whatever.
Yeah,
right?
and all the the ways the students are judged, for example, every single grade, every single test, every standardized test, every, applying to college, which is something my younger daughter's involved with now. It's a big deal, and I know you've been involved with these things yourself as well.
Yeah, I do see that. So I've got two kids. One graduated from college about a year and a half ago, and the other one is just starting at UW-Madison. And I mean, when I applied to college, so I mean, we're talking a million years ago, it was pretty simple and straightforward. Now, there were a lot of kids, now that I think about it, because I went to a college prep high school, but I didn't intend to go to college. And a lot of them were pretty stressed about stuff. I got to get all my extracurriculars in.
Right.
And I was always like, why? Who cares? I mean, just go to college. And it kind of, I didn't realize that in terms of where you go, there's no real difference in quality between going to a state school and one of the Ivy Leagues. The people at the Ivy Leagues aren't any smarter, but they are very well connected, and it does give you a sort of leg up on things. But the amount of work that you have to do in order to make yourself a suitable candidate really seems excessive. And it was kind of excessive back then, but now it's crazy. One of the kids decided to apply to Ivy League schools and didn't get in. And it's not a big surprise because they're not a legacy. They're all the kids that are applying who aren't legacies are super smart, have done a million extracurriculars. So how do you actually stand out? You don't.
Yeah. And a lot of it's luck right now, I think.
Yeah.
Do you happen to hit the right person on the right day who's looking at your application? And did you, maybe they're looking for a trombone player or something. It's so wild. So again, we cannot use these as measures of our worth as humans. And
that's a good point. Yeah.
That's what I always think about now, because I think growing up back in the day, it's like, oh yeah, that person is better, sort of like the preconceived notion. So again, I love the Stoic, question your impressions and your knee-jerk thoughts based on maybe your conditioning. And we do still have a society filled with credentialing too, right? Like, oh, that person, got this MBA or whatever, so therefore they must know more. But you want to have a healthy skepticism on all these things, and I think Stoic practice helps with that. I was going to ask about your philosophical counseling a little bit. It's a very interesting field to me, and I wondered if you could just share briefly, what is philosophical counseling and how do you do it?
Okay, yeah, I mean it's a kind of, what's the right word? I want to say heterogeneous, but that's not quite the right word. It's a diverse field in terms of approaches. And it's also got two different names. So it's called philosophical counseling here, and I believe in Canada. And then in most parts of the world, it's called philosophical practice. So it's been done in Europe for longer than, in an official way, longer than it has been here in the United States under the rubric of philosophical practice. And there's two main training and certification organizations here in the United States. One of them is very into logic-based therapy and is kind of narrow in their approach to things. And then the other one, the one that I belong to, the American Philosophical Practitioners Association, is more humanistic and kind of eclectic in its approach. So I guess what you could say, covering all of them, is that you're taking concepts or practices and approaches from the field of philosophy and you're applying them within the scope of people's lives. So it could be personal problems, like, I do a lot of work with people on anger, but it could also be applying it to workplace conflicts, or to trying to figure out what's going on with your job search and where you would actually find meaning and how to prioritize. Sometimes people will contact you and they'll say, I just feel stuck, and so you got to explore that quite a bit. And so you'll use things that are drawn from philosophy, and they could be as big as a method, right? Logic-based therapy considers itself to be a method. We could also talk about like applying Stoicism or Aristotelianism or something like that as a method. But a lot of times it's pretty dialogical. You're listening to people, then, saying, okay, so I need to ask you these questions to understand better and see if you can get them to articulate things. And sometimes they'll have insights that are helpful. Sometimes they want an accountability partner, So there's a lot of overlaps with other areas. It is in the United States, it was very deliberately set up as not being a medical practice,
right?
Because there's so much baggage associated with that. So like we don't take insurance, and we don't call ourselves psychotherapists, because if we do, we could get into a lot of trouble. It would be bad for the field. I think, in other places where they're not so legalistic, there's a little bit more overlap, right?
Yeah, this is interesting to me. I really love this idea. I'd love to be counseled philosophically and maybe even practice it someday. Because
I probably are already doing some of that. I mean, the reason why I went through training and certification was because I realized that in my work with colleagues and other people that I knew, I was already doing that work. And I think, for example, your book on parenting, I think, is doing that kind of work, right? Without not necessarily doing it in the one-on-one way. Although I think you've probably done that too, right? On occasion.
I talk to people, and what more informally right now, but I did get training in coactive coaching over the past couple of years. And so I actually have coaching certification in that because I did want to feel I had a little more of a structure around how I could talk to people. And it, as you said, it's kind of something I was doing already. It is something that also comes to me naturally because I like to ask questions and I'm very curious about people. And I really love this idea that we can all figure out kind of what our life philosophy is and sort of refine it to live better, right? And I think that's kind of the same impulse in coaching of all kinds. Good coaching, and because there's some that's not, but the real coaching, and I think coactive is quite a good and interesting model. But also this philosophical coaching model is also really, really interesting to me. And I think, this, because the issue with philosophy is, a lot of us when we were in school, if we ever even took philosophy, which I never really took a formal class in philosophy in high school, college, or grad school. I took intellectual history. And I took, for example, political philosophy, but it wasn't really ethical philosophy. It was more like, how does this apply to kind of the history of governments and people's self-rule and so on. But anyway, because I think I was turned off by the types of philosophy, especially that were being emphasized in the 90s. And it was just, I don't know, it didn't really do it for me. And I didn't see the practical applications. I didn't really care as much about metaphysics. I care about ethics. I care about how to live. And so now I'm just excited that there's more emphasis on this, both in people like you with your work and your teaching, but also just these books being written that are more, towards the book that I wrote with Massimo and Greg Lopez, Beyond Stoicism. It's like that. And everywhere when I talk to people and I just chat with them about myself and I mention my book sometimes and they say, oh, well, I could never because I don't study philosophy. No, this is meant to be accessible. It's meant to be interesting. It's meant to be something you could think about using. This is why we have exercises. And then I have my blog, as you said, on mostly on parenting, but also on just living as a human being. And then I'm hoping to turn my blog into a book soon, hopefully, and just kind of, using these ways to interact with people, both in writing and online and these kinds of conversations to apply practical philosophy to how to live our lives in, a more coherent, hopefully more ethical, and honestly more fulfilled kind of existence when you know what you really should be focusing on.
I think that's one of the things that you touched on there is maybe one of the biggest challenges in front of us, which is getting people to see that philosophy is for them, right? Because like you said, people are like, oh, I don't know, that seems really difficult stuff. And for them to understand that, first of all, that it can be made accessible, but also that they have a right to be there. I think there was a lot of gatekeeping that went on. I know that, so I've talked about this before. In the you look at what philosophers would describe their activities as in the 60s and 70s and 80s in this country, and it was this elite thing, and we think the big thoughts that other people don't. We're not like worried about what business people are interested in. Not even economists, because they're not elevated enough. And there was this kind of attitude of, if you ask about what's the use of this, oh, you're one of those people, right? You don't really belong here, and then, and you can get away with that sort of stuff until people start asking you, okay, budgets are being cut in the university, justify your existence, and then they're like caught flat-footed and have nothing to say. And even without having that kind of elitism, there was another that was even in ethics. There's a lot of professional ethicists who are like, yeah, I just teach this stuff. This is not about, applying it to your life or anything. I'm just interested in like abstract questions of animal welfare, how to apply utilitarian reasoning to this problem. And they get very threatened when they see people actually applying it. And they'll use, language like, oh, you're watering it down, it lacks rigor. I had a guy, and I'm not going to name his name, but it was at the Aristotle and Aristotelian Tradition Conference that I go to most years because it's just down the road at Marquette University. And he was a chair of a department around here, long since retired. And he looked at my name badge, and he went over and got his coffee. And then he came back to me and he said, I know who you are. And I was like, oh, well, that's nice. And then he's like, I just want to tell you what you do isn't real philosophy. And then he turned around and walked away. And I was like, well, you prick,
Yeah, that's awful.
Yeah.
Oh my God. Talk about gatekeeping. My God.
Yeah. And I was even presenting that particular conference.
Wow.
And it's that. Now, it's not just an old school mentality. There's young people out there who also have that point of view.
Yeah.
And it's unfortunate because if you look at the history of ideas, so Pierre Hadot, he popularized the phrase philosophy is a way of life.
Yes.
Lots of other people were talking about it at that time and before him in France and in other places. I mean, you could think about James and the pragmatist tradition and stuff like that in the United States. Mm-hmm. So a lot of people were into that idea, and they were always pushing against like the academic and cultural establishment, who were saying, oh, no, philosophy is big thoughts, not for ordinary people. And they were all saying, no, philosophy in the past really was for whoever wanted to take it on and use it to improve their lives. And then, when you go back and you look at the people that we can read in a less, blindered way, you're like, yeah, Plato's all about this sort of thing. Even Aristotle, sure, maybe not the parts of animals or the categories, but the discussions of things in the ethical political works are definitely about how to become a better person and make other people better people and have decent relationships. And then we get to the Stoics and the Epicureans and later Platonists like Plutarch, and they're all about that sort of thing. Even early Christian thought, I mean, it wasn't like, okay, we're all gonna throw away the philosophy books and just read the Bible. It was, we've got a framework now, and let's take these ideas from philosophy and we'll sift them and see what actually works, and we're going to try to take people and make them less screwed up.
Yeah, the synthesis that they created is so interesting to me.
Yeah.
And I think it is about bringing, they said, I think they said it was Socrates who brought philosophy down to earth. That was a
quote
we used in our book. Yeah, right? And that's what I mean. I think you're right. I think this is really interesting to me. So along those lines, how do you use philosophy in your own life? Stoic philosophy or any other philosophies? I'd love to hear your take on this.
Less consistently than I probably should. is a good way to say it. I think for me, I think I'm kind of an outlier in this respect. Like sometimes I'll go on Stoic podcasts and they'll be like, which quotes do you like? And I'll be like, I don't do quotes, I read books and there's, I guess, quotes in them, and then the right passage will come to me at the right time, but it's in a context. Or they'll be like, which practices do you do every single day? And I'll be like, well, I don't actually have a lot of, like, okay, it's 9 o'clock. It's time to do some negative visualization or something like that, right? Instead, it's more, I guess you could say this is going to be it's a term that we all use and it often doesn't mean anything, but it is more organic, right? Mm-hmm. It is like a tissue of things. And so I find myself occasionally having like an idea or even a passage come to mind when I'm dealing with a particular situation. And that can be quite helpful. I can remind myself, I'm inferring this from this other unrelated thing. This is a bad idea. And then it recalls, Epictetus saying, here's some mistaken reasonings, I'm richer than you, so I'm better than you, right? So I can be like, I can do that analogy with that. Like if I go to the gym and I get upset, which doesn't happen to me very often anymore, but comparing other people's bodies to my own, which used to be a big problem for me when I was like in my 20s and actually had a pretty nice body that I could compare, but there's always somebody better, and then feel sad or whatever. Yeah. So, having something like that and then having, you're like, yeah, this is a bad line of reasoning. I need to avoid this. Or, with anger management, it's turned out that the Stoics, Aristotelians, Platonists, and various Christian authors have been very helpful for me over time, whittling away at it. So I usually notice because I get into a situation and afterwards I'm like, 5 years ago, I would have been really pissed off, or I would have been anxious, or I would have said this to this person and probably screwed things up. And I didn't even feel tempted to do that now. Right? So there's some of that going on. I would say too, my wife, Andy, who she's also been studying philosophy for quite a long time. And, we've faced a lot of challenges in our life, health, financial, dealing with relatives, crazy bosses, job shifts, you name it, right? Cars breaking down, all deaths of pets and occasionally humans that we're close to. So, we use philosophy in kind of a supportive way to deal with that. As a matter of fact, if you don't mind, so I've been invited to be part of one of the Plato's Academy's things on love and friendship, and to talk about Aristotle. And I told Andy about that, and she was joking with me. And I think I may have actually sent this on to Casey. Andy was like, so in the presentation, you can, here we go. Will you talk about me, how much you love me, how I am your most significant relationship? Will your talk be called All About Andy? And of course, she's really joking with that. And I was like, that'd be kind of funny, So we could take philosophical couples, and I think it would actually be a really good thing. And I may pitch this to Donald and Casey and some other people, where I think people on the outside, they imagine, oh, wow, they're both into philosophy. Their life must be amazing together. And I think it would be really helpful for people to hear, no, we get in fights and we have to deal with crazy crap where one of us is being irrational and the other one is being, if not fully rational, at least less irrational. And there's all these, it's like whack-a-mole with life. One problem gets solved, another one comes up. I think it would be helpful for people to hear that. It's good to seek out a partner who is, broadly speaking, philosophical, right?
Yes.
But it's not a magic bullet that cures everything.
Right. Well, it sounds like this is kind of an amazing story of personal growth that you have, and that you and Andy are building together in this story of your relationship. I mean, it's kind of about that awareness that you're bringing. I mean, you mentioned going to the gym. Yes, this is very relatable, very relatable. And it's something that I think we all have to be super aware of, and that's the baseline. But then you clearly, like, over time, you're applying your philosophical principles, I would say, to like your mindset, like your basic. It doesn't have to be like, I also agree with you where people will say, oh, what are your practices? I mean, I have things I do, but it's not like, as you said, I'm not really much of a person about habits either. And so it's not like I have to do this at that time. It's more, how do you actually kind of react in the moment? Like, you see that person at the gym, and how do you become aware of what your thoughts are, question your impressions, ask yourself what's really true here, what really matters to me, all those things. And I think, you clearly are living it. And I also want to give a call out to your social media channels. I love them and I follow them very religiously because I always love your comments. You're very real and you're very honest and you are opinionated, which I personally enjoy, because I think we need this. We need to also kind of have a strong voice. And I think a lot of people are afraid of that. I work I work in the corporate world, and people are so afraid to have a voice, or there are these voices out there that are just like extreme partisanship, and know what they're going to say before they say it. So, having an authentic kind of voice that you bring based on your personal growth through your philosophy, your teaching, your interaction with students, with Andy. I mean, this is really good stuff.
Yeah, and I think that it's good to have to stake out positions, right? And then you have to be able to explain them by something better than, oh, that's just my feeling or something like that. That's important too, providing reasons, which is, a kind of modeling, I suppose, and that's part of what we try to encourage students to do, instead of just saying, oh, I just happen to feel this way, or this is the cause that I endorse.
You can't just do it on vibes, as my kids would say.
Yeah. And go ahead.
Go ahead. No, you please.
Well, I was going to say, like, going back to Stoicism, there's a lot of people who, you see this a lot in the discussion groups in Facebook. They're on Team Stoicism, but they may as well just have, like, they may be rooting for the Packers or the Browns or whoever, because it's like they're right no matter what, and this practice is going to be amazing for me. And it's, what you really want is something that's, I don't know, more measured, more rational, giving reasons for why this should be a good idea to do things this way. I mean, it's cool if Seneca said that you should do something this way, but Seneca also said we don't have kings, we get to decide for ourselves.
That's right.
And there were some parts where he's like, the Stoics say this, but that's clearly crazy, and here's why,
Right. And having an orthodoxy around it is not, to me, philosophically healthy.
That's right. Yeah.
You know what I mean? So you have to constantly bring your mind and your critical thinking. And in terms, you mentioned some hard times that you've faced over the years. What would you say in your life philosophy or your approach kind of helps you keep going through tough challenges?
That's a good question. I mean, one thing I find quite helpful, and you can probably relate to this as somebody who's done, a lot of work and reading in the history of ideas, is going to the past helps us to contextualize where we are in the present. So like when we went through the pandemic, there were a lot of people who are like, on the one hand, I won't give in to fear, and they're completely driven by fear. And, oh, the mask, you won't make me wear a mask or take a vaccine. And it became very much about their identity that way, in ways that were quite damaging to themselves and their community. And then there were other people who were like, this is the end of the world. And, if you know enough about human history, you're like, well, I think Justinian's plague was probably worse than this.
Yeah.
And, the flu epidemic in the teens and 20s.
The bubonic plague in the Middle Ages.
Yeah. I mean, which isn't to say we trivialize things, right? But we're like, these challenges are not completely unique. And here's like a big picture thing I've been thinking about for a while. So here in America, we enjoyed this time of great growth and prosperity after World War II. So the boomer generation got to see things, unless you were unfortunately, a minority in the wrong place. Women also had a lot of handicaps. They didn't get to open their own accounts until like the 70s. But for the most part, things were pretty good, and people took that as like, this is the model for things. And then for Gen X, things were still decent, but there were a lot of warning signs. Housing became much less affordable. College became much more expensive. Loans become worse. And then for the millennials, it's tougher. And for the current generation, people are like, why aren't they buying houses? Well, how the hell are they going to do that?
Right.
Why aren't they investing in their retirement accounts?
Yeah, right.
With what money?
Or having kids. I mean, that's a big topic, right?
Yeah. So I think that Americans got themselves tricked into this mindset that, like, we all get to have the great American dream, and it's been eroded. And then now it's been very accelerated. Our place in the world has been basically undone by, just a year, not even a year at this point, of policies and breaking treaties and saying crazy stuff. And, we're never going to get that back. And so you can look at that and be like, this is a catastrophe. And then you can also be like, well, I mean, what was it like for Augustine as the Roman Empire in the West was collapsing around him and he saw Rome get sacked? We're still reading Augustine today. Yeah. And feeling like, even though his culture doesn't exist anymore, there's something still worthwhile to his writings in life and example. Stuff like that helps me to avoid falling into those snap judgments about, oh, this is terrible, this is great, all of that, I would say. And then, there's other things. Stoicism is good for reminding us that we are capable of handling a lot of the stuff that we get thrown our way, that other people have handled it. There's that line in Epictetus, if death was automatically something so scary, then Socrates would have been afraid of it, but he wasn't. So that's a possibility for you, And then I think one of the big challenges, though, especially if we are parents or spouses or, connected to other people, is we not only have to make sure that we're relatively okay, we also have to look out for other people who may be more affected by stuff because they haven't been practicing some useful philosophy. So like my kids, will sometimes get quite upset about things, and it would be silly for me to be like, well, Epictetus says, here's what you ought to do. That's not really helpful. No. So you got to be available for
Right. And you have to kind of be real about it. And I think you are very real. And I think that's, in acknowledging that, there's a lot of chaos out there. There's a lot of stuff that we don't love. And so, any other kind of advice that you would give to people who are seeking to define their life philosophy or their sense of purpose in this world today?
I mean, there's lots and lots of people that are involved in like the network and community that we're
Mm-hmm.
connected with. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
you think about, and that's kind of a cool thing. So we, you ask people who are the people that you look up to, right? And they're like Martin Luther King or Gandhi or stuff like
Yeah.
that, or Mother Teresa. These, I mean, they're all gone, and they're like these kind of, I don't know, the heroic, inaccessible people.
Right.
I mean, think about Chris Gill, right? I
Yeah.
mean, he's a great guy,
Yeah.
and he's super knowledgeable about philosophy, but you can sit down with him and have a chat, and he's a normal person.
Right, right, right. And he'll answer very basic questions. I had some really,
Yeah.
Simple questions for him.
And he won't make you feel bad.
And he wouldn't.
Him.
Yeah, exactly. So I mean, that's a perfect example. I think there's a lot of people out there, and just people, in my Stoic network who are trying to use, as we just said, philosophy in their daily lives, like just trying to apply it somehow. To me, those are our role models, and that's more of a hero to me. That's relatable, understandable.
Yeah, I've been fortunate to meet some of, I guess, what you could call my academic heroes, the people whose works I read and reference and cite. Sometimes through Stoicon was a big thing for that, because they bring in these big speakers like Julia Annis, who turned out to be great. I mean, I'd been reading her stuff for 20 years before I finally met her. Anthony Long is of that sort. So there's like the big heavy hitters. I got to work with Alistair McIntyre over a summer, and he was the real deal when it comes to virtue ethics. He'd actually, like, at conferences, he would see me like from across the room, and he'd be hobnobbing with the important people, and then he'd be like, "Oh, excuse me," and he'd come across and he'd ask me about, like, how are your wife and kids doing, or how's the prison teaching going, or things like that. He was a real egalitarian that way. And so we've got those, and then we've got like the people that are basically on our level, our peers, that turn out to be good people. I mean, it's nice that philosophy helps to make them that way. So
Right.
we could talk about a lot of the people that we have in common, like Massimo Pigliucci or Greg Lopez or Donald Robertson, Brittany Palat. I mean, we're probably, and I mean, it's unfortunate because we're going to end up leaving a bunch of people out who might feel like, oh, they don't like me. And then I suppose we're probably both at the point where we have junior people who we connect with, and we're like, there's some real potential here. Let's encourage that. And then we have productive interactions with them. And so, forming those bonds, and they don't coincide with like some sort of membership list.
Exactly. It's not about using knowledge, as you said, to gatekeep or to kind of exclude people. It's, to me, and I think this is so true in the spirit of your work, it's about sharing the knowledge. It's about sharing the possibilities. And I'm always surprised, because Stoicism has become more popular. I'm always surprised when I just encounter people and I mention Stoicism, and their eyes light up and they start to ask me about it. And just a barista, I happened to, actually, I was carrying around my book because I was going to show it to somebody, and he saw my book, said Stoicism. Oh, I'm so interested in that, and a woman I met on a hike in Yosemite, and she's a young woman in her 20s. I wouldn't have necessarily expected. And so there's people from all walks of life who are now being exposed to it thanks to social media. So, okay, we know that some of it out there is not accurate to actual Stoicism. We know there's also Broicism, which is not what I would advocate at all. But there are people who are learning some of the basics of Stoicism, who are finding it so relevant and interesting that they will actually respond if somehow you have that connection. And so I love that.
Yeah, and actually, now that I think about it, and I think this is already there, like maybe in the introduction to the book. So Stoicism could be kind of like the proverbial gateway drug, and then we can say, oh, by the way, there's also all of these other really cool traditions or standalone philosophers who you might want to check out, because what we have in Stoicism is great, but it doesn't cover everything, you know?
Exactly. It is a gateway. It is a way of realizing Stoicism can apply, or a philosophy can apply to your everyday life, and can inspire you to live better, or to live in, ways that you didn't think of before. And for me, a lot of it is aspirational. This is part of why I adopted Stoic thinking, is, to try to improve the parts of myself that I struggled with, and to try to be that person I wanted to be. So of course that's the baseline. People have to want that, right? And my hope is that, sometimes times of chaos and, craziness actually do inspire people to want to kind of find a path.
I'm kind of curious.
Mm-hmm.
So, we have this, let's call it the problem of the Stoic sage, right? Because the notion of the wise person was pretty widespread across philosophical schools, but a lot of people's schools, like that of Aristippus, it's deflationary. They're like, it's a smart person. They still screw up every once in a while. But the Stoic sage is this, not only like, perfect person as far as knowledge and virtue and wisdom, but I mean, they go really overboard. He's also, or she's also, like the most erotic, meaning they're the best lover, they're dialectical, they're the best drinking companion, and after a while you're like, come on,
Right.
I don't really buy this. But there is this, like, and we've had some conversations about this recently in different places. I actually think that for a lot of people, the idea of the sage winds up causing them too much trouble and anxiety, and they should just like set it aside if that's the case. But nobody else has to. And so when you think about, I forget exactly what phrase you used, but thinking about like a better you, is it an ideal you who like ticks off all these great boxes? Or do you just want to be, somebody who's clearly further along, but, still fallible and screws up every once in a while. But when you screw up, you bounce back quicker. Because, myself, I think when I was younger, I did have that like perfectionist ideal.
Yeah.
And now, people are like, what do you want to be like? And I'm like, I don't know. I mean, a little bit better.
Right.
I don't want to keep making this stupid mistake over and over again. And then people are kind of surprised. They're like, why don't you shoot for something better than that? So where's
that's so interesting, Greg. I mean, it may be also one of the benefits of, getting a little older and a little wiser, is knowing that, I know now, maybe I didn't know in my 20s, but I know now that I will never be perfect. And here's my thinking on this. And it's something I've said to my kids many times. What is perfect? If you're perfect, are you a robot? I don't, a perfect being to me would be robotic. It would be sort of like every time it is the right thing. Like, that is not interesting to me. To me, maybe I'm sort of a humanist in that way. Like, nothing human is foreign to me. Like, I believe that human beings, we all have our fallibility. Yeah. And that's actually, in a way, part of the beauty of being human, because we are not robots. We're not going to always make a certain choice. I also like to believe in free will, that, we can make better choices. So that's really what it's about. I like to think about making better choices, and also being able to accept the things that you aren't that great, but that, that's part of life, and not in a way, it's fighting perfectionism. It's sort of the opposite of the Stoic sage to me. It's the ability to find that understanding and acceptance about the world and about myself, and just keep aiming for the virtues, aiming for the things that make me a better person, with those two pillars in Stoicism around, being someone who can think and be rational, but in the sense of using my brain to think about things, not necessarily just reacting or, giving into emotion immediately. Like, let's think. and then the other side of being community minded and being a pro-social person. Like those to me are the two big pillars in Stoic thought that really keep me attracted to it, like keep me going with it. You know, we need to find those communities, and even just the smallest community, you know, even just the people in my hallway, my office, like let's have lunch, let's talk, let's find out what we have in common, or what our interests are, how we can help each other, just all those things. To me, that does make the world better and my world better.
Yeah, and I think that's an aspect of Stoic philosophy that, at least for me, I probably didn't get or downplayed more at the beginning than I do now. I think it's really, really important. And maybe that's part, you know, like you mentioned Broicism. You know, we have all these funny monikers for like deformations of Stoicism, like writing Stoicism with a $sign.
Right. Yes.
I'm not sure how that should be pronounced, but you know, when people do that sort of stuff, it's partly because they've got wrong-headed ideas about what's good.
Right.
They don't understand that if you're just trying to posture and be a super macho, okay, that's not remotely Stoic, and that's, you know, irrational and could be bad for you. But you know, trying to make a buck off of everybody isn't good either.
Right.
But they also do lose that, or they deform that social connection that we ought to be having, and they only seek out their own types. You know, like broicists seek out other broicists or potential broicists to like you know, try to harden up and be a man.
Yeah.
And you know, I guess for the $S Stoic, there's basically just marks and fellow exploiters, you know, which is a very, you know, limited community. It's not a community that could actually sustain itself.
And it becomes kind of tribalism too. It's like,
that's right.
It's me versus you. Here, I'm this tough Stoic warrior, and you're out there, and you know, almost everyone falls into that out there
with an AI generated image of Marcus or somebody
with big muscles, huge muscles,
exactly.
right?
Yeah.
So it's, you know, and I think unfortunately people don't have a lot of time. People are busy, and they're not necessarily going to study it. And hopefully they'll watch your videos, and hopefully they'll listen to this and maybe get a few insights they didn't have. But many times it's hard for people to find that time, and it's just, you know, oh, here's this digestible thing.
That's
so
true, yeah.
Maybe also, like, I do think, you know, back to when you mentioned that someone said to you, oh, it's not real philosophy. That person is wrong. And that person is part of the reason why I think, you know, we need to, and I say this as sort of a community of people interested in practical philosophy, make it accessible. And we need to also like make it bite-sized pieces that can sort of counterbalance this stuff like Broicism and Stoicism with a $sign that's, you know, sort of, you know, warping it to fit people's needs or their tribalism on a certain thing. And I think this is kind of one of the duties I feel. This is part of why I keep sharing. Like, I feel that this kind of thinking and this just philosophical approach can not just help an individual live better, but can also help, you know, spread this throughout our community somehow. I mean, that's my hope, that it can make for better people overall if they kind of are able to absorb some of those messages that are the better ones, the true ones.
This will sound like a Yogi Berraism, because what I'll say is, well, sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't. Immediately obvious. But, you know, that's the case. You know, Epictetus talks about Socrates' track record in one of his discourses, and he's like, you know, Socrates maybe reached one person in 1,000, but that didn't make what he was doing less valuable. And that one person that he did reach, that really, I mean, we want to have a better track record than that, but we're not gonna succeed every time. And so then the question should be, well, the follow-up would be like, okay, what do we do with the people who we didn't reach? Maybe instead of saying, oh, well, screw them, bye-bye, we're like, well, we didn't reach them this time. And some of them maybe we'll never reach because they're awful people and like being awful people.
Right.
But, you know, these others over here, we'll back off and give it some more time. And then with the people who we did reach, who are like, oh yeah, there's something here. What do we have to offer them as follow-up, I think is quite important. And again, we'll you know, plug the book. It's great. One of the things I really liked about the book, and that came out in my review, is all those well-designed practical exercises. So let's say, I don't know, somebody, we'll get away from Stoicism. We'll pick, the sort of the oftentimes viewed as like the big enemies, the Epicureans, right?
Yeah.
So somebody gets interested in that because you have a conversation with them and they're like, well, what would I do to actually practice this? And you're like, well, unfortunately, there's not a lot of text left, but here's what they are.
Right.
So you can read them. And then here's what you can try out. I think, so that does two things. One is it gives them something practically speaking, and in terms of knowledge, it's like a possession that they're handed. But there's also a message there that's undergirding it. I care enough about you to want to give you something that will prove helpful for you.
Yes, yes. I like the concept of, meeting people where they're at, or just offering something to try.
If you don't, I mean, how are you going to meet them?
Exactly. You are not. You'll be either up here or you'll be down there, and they'll be, So I think, that's, Thank you for your kind words about the book. I mean, really just trying to spread the word on these things, and I appreciate that. Maybe to wrap up, I was going to just mention, you're also just a super interesting guy because you have these other interests, and I know heavy metal is one of your interests, and cats, and working with cats, and I know that you're vice president of Almost Home Cat Rescue, MKE. And I was just curious about that. If you want to share a little bit about your work with cats, and
sure.
if you want to mention heavy metal, that's up to you, because that's also a cool interest that I've noticed you post about. How do these things make a difference in your life?
I'll just talk about the cats thing, because the metal thing could draw us off in a whole bunch of rabbit holes.
Sure.
Well, I had this. Well, my wife and I. She had two kittens that she adopted in New York City. They survived an apartment fire, and they were bonded together, couldn't be with any other cats. And then she ended up adopting these two dogs who the cats trained, because they were there first. And so we had our four-legged family. When I married her, they all became mine as well. And I loved the dogs and I loved the other cat, but I bonded most closely with this one cat, Sassy, who outlived everybody else. And she made it to 19 and a half years old, and we would do things like take walks around the city in like a little pouch, which was actually designed for small dogs. And I post a lot of pictures of her, and she and I were very close. And then she died, as they do. And I thought about this before she died, that I'd like to start maybe volunteering at like the Humane Society or something like that. And I didn't act on it right away. Instead, like I went to a cat cafe, which was kind of a disappointing thing. All these people who are, that you book an hour, all these people are in there to try to maximize their cat interaction, and the cats are stressed. But then there was this shelter in Green Bay that takes in a lot of like special needs cats, and we were up there for a soccer game, and we stopped in, and I just sat with this cat who was dying of cancer for about an hour, and she slept in my lap, and I was like, I think this is the kind of thing I'd like to do. And so then I found out about Almost Home, and they were actually in a building in an area that I used to live in, and their place is actually a shop, or was a shop, that was next to the coffee shop that I worked at. And so I like knew the place, and I went in there and started spending some time with the cats. And then a lot of the other volunteers were really great people, and they were like, you could volunteer. And I was like, yeah, that's a great idea. So you had to go through some training, and then you had to shadow people, and they would, show you what to do. And then I started doing shifts, and I've been a volunteer now for a little over 2 years. And then, over time, you go from being like the junior person who doesn't really know anything other than it's nice to take care of the cats, to getting more and more responsibility and knowledge. And when the vice president position opened up, I was like, I guess I could do that. So I applied and the board approved me. I'm still on probation, actually. You know, you get like 6 months to prove yourself. And if you don't, like if I screw up, then you know, I'm not out of the organization, but I won't be VP.
Right.
You know, I'll just give you one example of something I've been doing lately. So we have this guy, Mox, who's a 1-year-old cat who is rather skittish. He's bonded with another cat named Janie, and they're very close. And Mox doesn't like, in general, to let people get too close to him. He'll actually pop you, but he won't scratch you. Mm-hmm. And so I've been working with him for about a month. You know, he will let you pet him if he's like laying on a particular cat couch. And then recently I've been able to approach him in other places, and sometimes he'll pop me like, you know, 3-4 times, and I'll just like stick with it and keep moving in and put my hand on him. And at first he'd tense up, you know, and now he's actually letting me pet him and doing so multiple times per visit. And I'm trying to, some people like jokingly call me the cat whisperer, because I take the cats who are scared or you know, traumatized, and I get them to unwind. I call it sweetening. I work with them I give them some sweetness, and then they can be sweet to the people who will eventually adopt them. So last night we had a breakthrough. He actually let me pet him 5 times over the course of 2.5 hours. He did pop me a couple times, but it's basically just to, like, you know, kind of let me know what's going on. I actually got another person as I was petting him, and he was relaxed, to come up and let her pet him for a minute before he like turned around and popped her.
When you say popped, is this like sort of batting with the paws?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
but he's big and strong, so it's like, you know, like you can hear it when he pops you. It's, you know, it's like an actual pop, but he doesn't use his claws.
Okay.
But he'll do it like multiple times.
Wow. He's a fighter.
Yeah, and he's a cool guy, and he'll look at you, and you can see. Like, people who say animals don't have real emotions, they're full of crap, you know. You can look at him and you can see the yearning for connection in his little cat face, but he's not sure how to pursue it well. So I'm working with him just to try to get him to kind of open up and be able to ultimately, you know, have somebody else want to say, I want these 2 cats, I want to bring them home, and they'll have a life with me. And that's actually, I'll point out another thing too. So I've done a little bit of writing about this, and I need to do some more. One of the biggest challenges of doing work like this is you are giving care and concern and love to these animals who you're forming temporary connections with, and they are going to go on to somebody else. And so some volunteers end up quitting because they're like, I can't take this. I got too attached, and now I feel bad. So you have to find ways to get okay with giving all of that to an animal who then will be transferring that to somebody else for the rest of their life. And, you know, we've adopted now over 540 cats and kittens out. I haven't been directly connected to all of them, but I mean, I would say that there's at least 20 who I got very close to over the course of that time. And if Andy hadn't become, you know, more allergic to them, I might have actually considered trying to talk her into letting us adopt one of them or foster. So that's actually, I mean, and that's an understandable challenge, and not everybody has the resources of philosophy to help them out with it. So that's one area of applied philosophy where I'm trying to like produce some resources for my fellow volunteers to, I don't know, develop a more resilient mindset that allows you to not, once again, don't retreat into that inner citadel.
Right.
Come out of it and be there for this set of animals, you know.
It reminds me of a compassion practice. This is something I studied in a compassion cultivation training back in 2016. It's a really interesting practice because it's about being able to kind of sit with something that's hard or challenging or even suffering, and be present with it and express that sort of flame of compassion. I think of it as like an inner flame of compassion towards this other being, whether it's a human, whether it's a cat, and kind of bring that, but then be able to be okay with when that being's not there anymore. And sometimes that practice is used when someone is dying or very sick, or sometimes it's used when maybe someone's going away, or you're not in charge of that person or that cat, that being, but you're bringing that sort of light of your own, compassion and love, really, but then being able to kind of accept and be resilient about that. That won't always be there. That person, that cat, won't be there.
Yeah, and I think some people also worry that, I'm doing this and it's just like, and you could say this about any good thing that you're doing. It's not going to survive this moment, so what the hell good is it? And I mean, if we applied that logic to most of the things we do, we'd just become despairing and just give up on stuff.
I mean, it also has to be about the process. You have to enjoy being there, with the cats and kind of like loving that moment. I would think that sounds really, really fun. And I love your photos. And I mean, I guess to wrap us up, I would just say, how can people follow your work, Greg?
So it's interesting. I realized this recently. If you just Google Gregory B. Sadler, I have come to dominate Google's first 10 pages or so. So people can easily find, the YouTube channel or my Substack or stuff like that. It sucks for all of the other Gregory Sadlers out there. Actually, all you got to do is put in Greg Sadler or Gregory Sadler. You don't even have to put in the B.
Okay.
And there's lots of them because it's a very common name. Not as common as John Smith, right?
Right.
But it's bad for them because they can't get any traction, but it works out good for me. So.
Yeah. Well, again, you're very kind and compassionate, but we want people to be able to follow your work. So this is a great thing to do. Thank you again for this conversation. And, hopefully we'll continue our conversations in the future, continue our collaborations as well. And people can follow me on the Stoic Mom Substack, on Instagram, Blue Sky, etc. And thanks again, Greg, for joining me today.
Well, thanks for having me on.
It's been a great conversation.